Diagrams. What will you learn in diagrams? Diagrams represent ideas in visual form. Deleuze used the term an abstract machine for diagrams. Diagrams receive information like a machine, process it and present as a visual product. You will learn the importance of diagrams and see some samples. So why are diagrams so important? Can't architectural projects be inspiring without them? If we look at the representation tools of today's architecture, maybe, yes. Believe or not, people don't read anymore. Everybody wants to see a picture. So this is the most important task of diagrams. To schematize information. This is such an important task that being able to sell information also means being able to persuade the jury to the information presented by picture. Now, we will review the diagrams one by one. They have been carefully selected from projects that have achieved outstanding success in competitions and project presentations. But first, we need to look at the criteria for a diagram to be successful. If you follow these steps, you will be able to express the main idea of your project by creating excellent diagrams. Let's start. How should a diagram be? Should it be simple or complex? Should it be multicolored or monochrome? Should it divide the whole into its elements? Or should it combine the elements to form a whole? 1. A diagram should be simple, clear and prepared by sticking to the harmonious colors of a certain color palette. 2. The more software is used to prepare a diagram, the more likely that diagram will be successful. 3. The diagram must be striking, but certainly not embellishment. Every line in a diagram should have a meaning. 4. No item in the diagram should be too big or too small. This requires graphic design knowledge. Lines must be exactly the right thickness. A correct hierarchy should be captured between elements such as lines, dots, arrows, and a very elegant effect should be achieved. 5. There must be sufficient space between the items in the diagram, they should not be too separate or too narrow. 6. The design language, colors and expression technique of the diagram should match with the architectural function of the project. For example, a hospital structure should not be expressed with a diagram technique where abstractions are preferential. 7. The diagram should lighten the size of the building and, while showing the layers, should not emphasize unnecessary details. 8. The diagram should not focus on different narrative groups at the same time. For example, the diagram of the components that make up the structural system and the diagram showing the public flow should be shown as separate diagrams. 9. The effect of transparency in diagrams should be utilized if possible. Translucent layers that can be displayed on top of each other attract the attention of the jury, as they showcase the architect's ability to think layers together. 10. For those who want to achieve outstanding success in competitions and architectural presentations, it will be sufficient to comply with the above criteria and internalize the strategies in the diagram types in the following section. However, those who want to get detailed theoretical information about the subject can read Anthony Vidler's article named Diagrams of Diagrams, Architectural Abstraction and Modern Representation. This is a concise resource for those who want to gain depth on the subject. This and similar readings will be very useful for those who want to design and present diagrams that really get to the heart of the matter. Avoid superficial representations. Check out other resources below. Now, let's move on to the part that is directly related to our topic. Let's separate the diagrams into groups according to the most popular and frequently used types in architectural competition and project presentations, and look at the most important strategies for each type. Diagrams as architectural infographics. In this section, we will make a strong introduction to the representation of information and see that the representation of the relationship between pieces of information is at least as important as the plan, section, and view. Establishing relationships between pieces of information will prepare us for the next diagramming steps. Inspirations from conventional graphics. In the first example and the next few examples, we'll review some of the infographics that stand out from the presentation sheet you see on the right. When starting such a study, you can remember the chart types you use in Excel. When describing an architectural space, it is sometimes possible to use conventional graphic types as supporters in the lower layers. In this example, you can read from the graph how users in a residential area are divided according to their income and interests. The fact that the circle is divided into slices makes this reading easier, while the colors representing the slices also provide a detailed breakdown of each building. Classifying data into tables. The information that was perceived as sketchy in the previous graphic is included in this table in detail, supported by explanations. Respectively, this information is expressed in terms of user profile, working hours and capacity, service price range. After detailed explanations are included in the bottom line, another graphic that helps us to summarize all the information is provided below. The colors also makes it easy to follow. Following related concepts. One of the most important issues in architectural competitions is to follow the practical equivalence of theoretical concepts. Projects that can follow this trail correctly and establish the right relationships between the right concepts are unlikely to fail. In this example, which deals with the border theme, you see that leading concepts extracted from prominent explanations of theoretical figures are associated. Such a start increases the validity of subsequent design steps, and the jury begins to look more favorably on a project based on the causality principle. Strengthening the context with historical chart. Historical details enable establishing contextual relationships. Who used to live in this area? What structures used to be in this area? What kind of an architectural understanding was dominant in this area in the past? How many of the old approaches have been preserved today? How many have been corrupted? The time periods in which the region undergoes change consist of how many annual periods? All the answers of these questions will be included directly in the design process, with a systematic tabulation. Summarizing previous themes, including images 1 and 2. Sometimes, at a certain stage of the presentation, a summary of the slides or information presented so far is required. Therefore, a compact graphic expression of the information presented in a limited time is needed. In such a graphic expression, instead of tying the ties with very tight and sharp lines, dashed circles and free-form arcs can be preferred to remind the jury that these relationships can deepen and become more complex in the later stages of the narrative. Highlights can also be in the form of translucent paints, offering the same sense of flexibility and temporality. Working with invisible spheres. If the linear connections between the themes placed in dashed circles can be established with a detailed hierarchy, they can make the jury feel the dynamism created by the moving spheres in a space. This means an uninterrupted movement between concepts. For example, this composition will change and evolve as all the new information to be gained through data mining is added to this network of spheres or circles as they are on paper. Using prime shapes for very simple representations. Of course, impressions don't always have to be based on complex and intense relationships. At this point, it should be remembered that simplification is also a special skill. Since prime shapes are the most easily perceived by the brain, difficult themes can also be explained with this method. While more established and immutable concepts can be expressed with angular prime shapes, more transitional and flexible approaches can be expressed with circles and ovals. 2D to 3D effect with isometric view, including images 1 to 10. One of the rare examples, this study shows that even an academic paper can be incorporated into a diagramming process. What topic is this article about? In how many places are there examples of direct narrative and how many examples of indirect narrative in the article? Which concepts are more interrelated? Which concept is most emphasized in which paragraph? What percentage of the text do similar topics cover? And finally, what is the number of referenced sources and the number of referenced authors? How can a bibliography be represented in isometric perspective? You know, representing sources means representing information. Finding contemporary relationships between groups. Isometric representations allow us to easily see all the components in that workspace and to follow the relationships easily. For this, the associated components can be shown with a circular painting. Associated circles can also be connected to each other with the help of dashed arcs. This example shows the relationships between Dadaism, Surrealism, and leading actors. On the next slide, we can see that this relationship can also be established with linear connections and how the language of expression has changed. If there is a hierarchical relationship between the components, it would be more correct to prefer this way. The other example is important in terms of expressing the hierarchical representation includes organic connections within itself. Let's not forget that these curvilinear lines can also help us to show unexpected and undisclosed implicit connections in all the diagrams we draw. Infographic prisms with historical charts. So what can we do if we want to show both the relations between the leading figures and their historical positions? In this case, the diagrams that we will prepare with a few simple SketchUp moves come to our rescue. As you can see in this example, each gray band represents an important theme or group of themes. Prisms, on the other hand, represent figures who have worked on these themes and contributed to the production of theoretical knowledge. When the prisms, the numbers they correspond to and the relationships they establish, it is seen that a very powerful form of representation emerges. Rearrangement of theoretical relationships. Perhaps one of the most common mistakes architects make is to divide the sheet into parts with precise boundaries and say things like, "Let there be diagrams in this section. Here are the models," etc. However, as in this example, presenting the models together with a diagram about them will strengthen our narrative and increase intelligibility. Minimalist tabulation, including images 1 and 2. The two examples we will see now stand out as examples of how a sophisticated tabulation system can convey information in a simple form at once. In this first example, we can not only see the historical place of the important events that determined the architectural fate of the favelas, but also the causality between the events that triggered each other. Remember, the more data a diagram can understand at the same time, the more valuable it will be. In the second diagram, instead of the events, it is possible to see the leading figures and the relations between them. The same logic applies here. We can both follow history and read relationships. Creating data pools with historical layers. It is now very easy to access maps of a city from previous years. Summing up urban and architectural change by superimposing these maps can make your job easier when constructing the architectural context. Of course, while summarizing, it is necessary to bring notions together and separate them into groups. One of the biggest mistakes people make is forgetting that there can be groups within groups, that is, pools within pools. A good diagram should be layer by layer. Any situation where groups are nested and connected by fluid diagrams is an example. New coordinates in space. And the last title in the architectural infographics section. When you want to create an isometric setup by expressing horizontal and vertical coordinates, try to create the perception of unlimited space. To do this, create a series of relationships with very thin lines, slightly thicker dots, and dashed lines. You will find that the options here are much more than a standard isometric diagram. See you in the next section. Diagrams about photographs and modular collages. This section includes 7 images. We will see how data can be obtained using only photographs through the steps of a project, and we will examine a systematic example of the collage technique. In the collage technique, different pieces can come together randomly or they can come together depending on a certain set of rules. The first image shows a systematic unification. 2 photos of a project area are divided into equal parts and made into a collage. This is an innovative and unusual way to describe the experience of the user who sees both spaces in succession. In the next image, there are representations of how this combination can change the perception of the silhouette. Then, the silhouettes are reduced by being represented by red vertical bands and the representation is simplified. Then, we see the visuals that are created when these works are evaluated together. We begin to explain to the jury how the parts that make up the silhouette evoke each other in the perception of the city and the differences between the city itself and its perceived state. In the last two images, we apply the vertical division in the previous images with circles sticking to an orthogonal order. The most important lesson to be learned here is that collage can be an important tool in representing the user's perception of space. See you in the next. Diagrams about movements of the body and swarm. This section contains 25 related images. Movement is a subject that is not used enough in architectural competitions, but has very important potentials. Very successful projects can be achieved if the movements of the users can be tracked in certain periods, and these periods can be presented in impressive, sequential representations. Two examples, which we will now see in succession, show how a simple installation of rectangular prisms can change human movement. In the first example, we see how the projections of human movements are reflected on the areas. Thinking about similar possibilities can come in handy when designing a facade that shows the movement around it from different angles. Please try to think through all the examples you see, remembering how you can use them in your own project. In the second example, there is another installation that questions the boundaries and stretch areas by changing the modulation of the boxes and using the mesh. Two completely different types of movement and two completely different semi-open spaces. The third project, which we will see in this topic about the movement, looks at the movement from a more professional perspective. If the movement is handled with an interdisciplinary perspective and the achievements of architecture are evaluated together with software solutions, you can produce magnificent results. The example in this study is also about this. Using the processing program, videos of different installations are analyzed and radical movement sequences in the videos are represented in red. For this, with the help of the program called Color Summarizer, the rate of color change in each sequence can be determined. While all these details are important in themselves, the most important thing is to remember that you can use even data that is difficult to track, such as motion, as a tool to improve your architectural context. In all these slides you see, movement is broken down into parts, measured, compared and evaluated. As the variety of movements increases, the options for representation also increase, and the forms of representation specific to each movement's own stretching areas develop. And the last project. In order to see the motion on isometric drawings, we identify circle-shaped density fields and trace the motion. The spots defined by the movements in a house transform the orthogonal structure of the form and give us the opportunity to rethink the form of a house. You can enrich your presentation with blind spots in heavily used areas and theoretical footnotes related to this experience. The important thing is to follow the movement and convey the architectural language through perspective, plan or section. Diagrams about location plans. In this section, we will look at site plans and examine how diagrams contribute to the intelligibility of site plans. Zoning by functions. This section includes two images. In the first image, we see how isometric diagrams contributes to the understanding of that site plan. On the left is a very simply illustrated image. On the right, it is possible to see the architectural solutions for the area in isometric form. While we look at the field incrementally, there are many examples where we make use of diagrams in two dimensions. Let's look at this example in order. 1.1. Holistic view. 1.2. STAD dust, attribution to urban memory and functional transformation. 1.3. Small-scale beach gardens and recreational access. 1.4. A square and a park. In the next image, we move on to the other parts of the map that we examined in the previous section. Detailed modeling with circulation. This section includes 3 images. In this section, the flow between the structures is shown and how the users in the area are distributed when different activities are carried out in the area are illustrated. Here, the SketchUp model is made to represent different scenarios with the addition of human silhouettes in Photoshop. In this example, we see detailed user profiles and a closer representation of the actions. In the next example, we see inferences about how spaces define intersection areas according to user profiles and which user profiles the spaces are most suitable for. Representing semi-abstract concepts. After making all the inferences in the same sheet, sometimes a design product does not emerge and a semi-abstract concept can be expressed to describe this intermediate stage. In this case, using a grid at the bottom can make our job easier, both to reach some concrete data and to develop a fluid design language. This not only adds scalability to the architectural language, but also translucent colors can represent transitivity, indicating that this design has not been completed yet or that it represents dynamic movement. Additional models with footnotes. This section includes 3 images. Sometimes we demonstrate the site plan, but we also need anecdotes or diagrams about it. This example is about that situation. As you've seen here, we see examples supporting them can be presented in the same set of drawings. The next image is also about this subject. These are examples of using an isometric perspective in the representation of public spaces in a public park and between apartment settlements. And in a final example, it is possible to support it by showing an isometric perspective how the restaurant structures are lined up along the coastline. Minimal and light representations. Sometimes it may be necessary to choose a very light language according to the density and weight of the composition. While it is not always possible to maintain this language, such a minimalist start can reinforce the feeling that the center of gravity of the composition will be visible in next stages, and these prepare us to see the actual product. Creating a living isometric diagram with icons. When a sufficiently expressive isometric perspective is expressed with icons, all the actions performed in the field can be displayed on a single diagram. In this way, you can express both the landscape layers, the functional layers, and the circulation with a single isometric perspective. Demonstrating layers of a complex. A complex can contain key components within it, such as rational installations, green lines, housing units, greenhouse structure, and additional functions. While showing these components, it would be much more efficient to construct the isometric diagram as a series of layers in order to make the whole system visible. Let's examine together how you prepare the jury to see the design. Summarizing design process. Diagrams and stages. 1. Modular dividing. 2. Public spaces and continuity. 3. Horizontal traces. 4. Insulation and functional formation. 5. Sustainable greenhouse structure. 6. Modular harmony. Settlement in a dense urban texture. It is important to show how you settled in a dense urban fabric in stages, as it not only tells you how you are doing a modulation study for that area, but also the idea of establishing a balanced relationship with the historical building. Evaluating an existing building with urban design. Let's examine, in 5 steps, how the traces of the existing stadium structure are handled together with the new urban design proposals. 1. Sustainable approach for gaps. 2. Recreation for reaching the shoreline. 3. Segmentation. 4. Multivista and social continuity. 5. Holistic flow. You can try different solutions by applying the ordering and association style in these sections to our own project. This will be an important step to express your project in the most sophisticated way. Transforming existing landscape texture. Sometimes showing existing plants and proposed plants together can give the jury an idea of how the space can be transformed. Therefore, while preparing such a diagram, it is necessary to use Photoshop and SketchUp together. The local context should be supported by giving together the existing plants in the area, the ones that cannot be planned to grow, and most importantly, the endemic species that need to be supported. Reading sustainability layers through rural. Rural life gives us a lot of options to think about sustainability and modulation together. In order to evaluate these empty spaces, we can use the grid texture by adhering to a clear modulation and show it with an approach that we benefit from primary possibilities of sustainability. First impressions about urban texture. This section includes 2 images. At a first glance at the workspace, we may need to present our most basic drawings in a reduced illustration before moving on to detailed drawings of that area. At this point, 5 topics here can give you an idea. 1. Traffic flow. 2. Continuity of green. 3. Emptiness. 4. Landscape. 5. Circulation. In this example on the right, we see the coloring of the areas where active circulation is intense and the emphasis on the related areas. Diagrams about layers of a building. In this section, we will examine a building in layers and discuss how to successfully highlight the desired points through diagrams. Transitions between forms. Let's take a look at how the current stadium structure has been transformed. 1. Reference to stadium form. 2. Evaluation of spatial potentials and functional transformation. 3. Mass fragmentation. 4. Sustainable construction for gaps. 5. Reaching to the shoreline. These steps also contain clues to the thinking processes you should use when constructing your context. Holistic views and divisions. Sometimes, after showing the model, it may be necessary to emphasize how the model allows pedestrian movement horizontally and vertically. A few Photoshop moves will be enough for this. Designing the dramatic effect. After we've worked out the relationship of mass to its environment in a site plan and built our basic ideas of context, we can now work on the dramatic effect of mass. For this, after making the necessary square meter calculations, it will be useful to make a detailed study on the shapes that the mass can take and to show it in stages. Systems, solid to multiple. If a monolithic structure still looks large and unwieldy due to square meters when fragmentized, such a structure can be designed as a greenhouse with a grid technique. In this way, linear partitions will make the building look smaller than it is, and will give this unity a unique architectural expression. Fragmentation for demonstration of plumbing. Giving the details only in the cross-section may be sufficient for some projects. However, if the competition is about energy saving and sustainability, it would be more beneficial to show the installation and the basic inputs associated with it, such as shade, sunbathing, thermal masses, north insulation through an isometric diagram. Separation of modules by functions. Sometimes, such a horizontally diverging, stylized diagram can be presented in order to strengthen the dramatic effect and express how the facade is covered with an approach. Layers of facade. If the facade of the project is designed as a curtain wall, walkways can be created between the building and the facade. In these areas, users can take a break, and with a successful lighting design, the facade can represent itself by creating different ambiances for 24 hours. Separation of floors by functions. This section includes 7 images. Here we see how a diagram presents information such as the usable balcony area on the roof, the gross square meter of the roof, the ground floor level, the car park level. All technical data can be easily expressed with the help of different isometric diagrams. In the next example, we see the place of the moving floor of an architecture museum building in Taksim Square in the general approach, and how the relationship established with the historical building affects the geometry of the floors. The next example concerns a mixed-use high-rise. Here, too, we see how the corridors that feed the core change direction in repetitive floor plans, how the landscape relates to the shops, how the social areas relate to the sports fields and green space, together with a typical office floor plan. Sometimes, it is necessary to see both the facade and the section together. For this, cross-section perspectives are among the tools that we use the most. When presenting floor plans, if you associate a section perspective with diagrams that include the architectural mass and the layout of the functions, and present them with a dissolution diagram that includes all the floor plans, you are giving more information about that place. When you design parametric forms, the best way to be able to see the floor plans, see the relationships that the floor plans establish with the landscape, and show closely how the vertical circulation works between the floors is to express all these with a common diagram. When we look at this example for a house, if you are working on a project related to the redesign of the interior spaces of a single house, the isometric view will again be the best solution to allow you to see all areas at once. Finally, there is an example of mixed-use tall buildings with a black background and negative color effect. If you use a black background, the lighting effect in render and semi-abstract images can also be taken as an advantage and use the contrast of colors to create a striking effect. You can choose relatively bright, even neon, accent colors. Diagrams about sustainability. In this section, we will see examples of how sustainability and infrastructure components can be powerfully presented through diagrams. Infrastructure and agriculture. Infrastructure elements that feed the mass housing units also determine the location on the ground level. Therefore, it may be necessary to adopt a semi-abstract and intertwined representation technique in order to express the installations above and below the ground together. The example here illustrates exactly this intricate structure. Defining modules of infrastructure. The more data you can present in a sustainability diagram at the same time, the more determination you will have of that structure's compliance with energy conservation criteria. In the examples here, we see details such as optimized greenhouse temperature, additional volumes, modular units, water tanks, heat pumps, optional plantation and summer bridges, along with elliptical lines of wind. Closer looks before facades. This section contains two images. Giving the details of the facades with an isometric perspective before the facades are presented makes it possible for us to present dynamic data such as opening, closing, as well as to show a large number of data at the same time by explaining them. This slide includes the north facade. The next slide shows the south facade with details of the moving micro-greenhouse structure. Dynamic components of ventilation and shading. Being able to divide the perspective into parts and show it in separate layers shows us both the movement of the wind, how the movable facade system works, what units are inside the office structure, and how the office structure varies between floors, as shown below, and how modulation works. While it is not possible to present so many data at the same time in the plan, section, or view, it becomes very easily expressed in a diagram. Local air conditioning with tracking of movements. In this example, too, we see yellow patches of gradual change in pedestrian density in the area. These spots, via the responsive floor, cause the shading and lighting modules above to move. These modules also have the feature of storing solar energy during the day and using this energy at night. Of course, from a diagrammatic point of view, what is really important here is the representation of a moving assembly in sequences in this way. Dynamic possibilities of sustainability. Contrary to previous examples with a white background, this example with a black background explains how a health unit can produce solutions for different purposes with mobile modules. If steel and membrane are used together as in this example, showing how the modules move, grow and shrink with dynamic displays will also contribute to the overall project. Let's look briefly at the details that can be shown in such a diagram. Many details such as portable ramps, wooden moving structure, steel beams and connectors, photovoltaic panels will help make the diagram more expressive. Diagrams about futuristic themes. Diagrams about futuristic themes. Layers of routes. We are generally interested in showing the movement of pedestrians, but sometimes the routes followed by vehicles can also give us an idea of the usage areas. Here, it is shown how a tourist bus can contribute to the construction of ramps for disabled access. This is an introductory schema. And the intricate diagrams make it easy to grab the attention of the jury, as they give the impression that you can think of multiple layers at once. Dynamic components of future. This section contains two images. When you can present the components of the steel structure with a dynamic approach about the future, you will show both the structural system options and the different shapes that the facade design can take. Another example under this title is about how prefabricated modules can come together under harsh conditions and how they can form housing units by overlapping in difficult disaster scenarios. In all these examples, the effect of the modular combination is undeniable. Organic possibilities beyond Earth. This section contains 4 images. Contrary to the orthogonal structures we are accustomed to in the world, design ideas resembling ant nests, such as biophilic designs, developed with the help of organic forms, have started to come to the fore in recent years. At this point, considering extraterrestrial possibilities can be quite mind-opening for your work. In this example, you see how a topography is reshaped with the help of micro-excavations, and how a unique geometry can be created by juxtaposing new mounds and collapsed areas created by blasting the excavated soil. In addition to the previous example, it is very important to stick to a more neon color palette and choose black anthracite tones that will strengthen the space theme, while presenting representations of the pieces of life that will occur in this space in order to achieve a more accurate contrast and increase the dramatic effect. If you can show the jury in stages where the microcapsules we just mentioned shape the soil like an architectural element, you will give the impression that each of these structuring steps has a unique place in your design process. This is the best part of diagrammatic expression, anyway. Not only the final product, but also the intermediate stages are presented. In this way, the semantic depth of the work can be conveyed to the jury in the most accurate way. In the next example, we see the sprawl that can arise when we combine challenging topographies with future scenarios. Sometimes you can create such unique design spaces by combining your vertical and horizontal weighted sketches to express the topography. As you see the new design possibilities that the elevation differences or the diversity of green and water elements provide, you will understand how the limitation of it feeds your creativity. Cities as bulletins. Sometimes you can support your modeling with the data in this bulletin by presenting future scenarios of metropolises as a bulletin. This not only allows you to see future scenarios as a newspaper, but also helps attract the attention of the jury by blending theoretical knowledge and modeling. Diagrams about modular combinations. Modular housing. In the first example, we see basic approaches to aggregation in a study of Brazilian favelas. The statements of the theorist named Perlman, who works on the subject, about the formation of bonds are schematized with the help of these diagrams. On the left, it is possible to see how the combinations in the settlements Cellula Urbana, Favela Rocinha, Favela Cloud and Heliopolis residences were designed, and below, 6 cases that emerged from Opalaca's researches. Presenting diagrams expressing the situations in the structures under study is very productive in terms of summarizing the approaches there before making new designs. Tabulation of modular combinations. If you can present all the projections you have made about the subject you have studied in the form of models, and you can support it with data from the past, you can use all the work of the theorists working on this subject in a historical tabulation. So, presenting everything you do in a common tableau, by creating horizontal and vertical connections, with a very strong effect and basing your context on this table will make your job easier in terms of influencing the jury. Possibilities for disabilities. This section contains 2 images. Mobility and modular diversity are of great importance in studies for the disabled. As we have seen in this example, it is important to see the library design to be built inside a bus in parts, as it emphasizes this modular approach. On the right, there are ramps and stand additions that can be applied to this bus. Below, we see the junction diagram of the modular bridges that make the use of terraces more mobile for disabled access. In the next image, it is possible to see how modulations can be communicated to the disabled with titles such as diffusing the tolerance, quality of routine, being socially and technically hybrid. In order to achieve an effect similar to the one in these diagrams, it will be sufficient to complete the basic models that we made using only the skeleton structure in SketchUp, with Photoshop and Illustrator. Using a limited color palette is often more effective than using too many colors. Modular use of local materials. If you are expected to design your project in a local texture, listing the appropriate material choices will give the jury a lot of insight into the contextual coherence of your work. How the wooden panels move can be seen in the 1:5 joint detail on the right. The middle detail describes how this setup can be done. On the far left, we see how all these modules can be stored and transported in 2+1, 3+1, 4+1 units so that they can be easily installed in a prism. Such diagrams are always indispensable as they show us modulation, motion, and possibilities. Life-saving shelters. Shelter modules that can be used in disasters primarily need a steel construction as they must be durable. Steel, which is considered a successful choice in terms of resistance to impacts and adapting to modulation variations, helps you to create successful visuals and diagrammatic representations as it can be easily adapted to modular combinations due to its nature. With programs like Tekla, you can add numerous combination details to your system and make your similar reproducible modules more mobile with dynamic details. If you want steel to be used in relation to future themes, you can choose diagrams that highlight examples that combine steel with solutions such as biophilic membranes or contemporary tensioning systems, and you can determine visualization strategies accordingly. Complex combinations for harsh conditions. This section contains 2 images. In difficult conditions, issues such as diversity of topography, transitions between water and land, and elevation differences may come to the fore. In such cases, you may need to design complex combinations instead of the conventional uses we are accustomed to in daily life. If you also sketch the connector corner modules before designing such joints, your modulation experiments will yield much more successful results. If these combinations contain details emphasizing the future scenarios, you can choose a darker background, choose lighter and brighter colors on this background, and use this contrast as a highlighting advantage. In the next image, how this modularity can be followed in the floor plans, how the sense of space is conveyed to the jury by giving the floor plans with an isometric perspective, how each module that makes up the spaces is presented one by one in a harmonious visual, and finally how each module is combined with the floor plans with the help of crosslinks. We can see that it is in a conceptual relationship. City as an exhibition space. This section contains 5 images. In this project designed in Jakarta, modular units run on the rail system, establishing a dynamic relationship between the most economically challenging regions of the city and the middle-high-income regions. Reading units, stages and workshop areas gain a mobile quality, shaking the usual perception of autonomous space in the city and contributing to the creation of crooked routes. While presenting such a manifestal approach, it is necessary to be able to give the feeling that the movement continues in the diagram and to show the concerns about mobility in all images. The representation of all buildings and all modules in a separate color reinforces this focused approach. In the next image, we see the steps of this project in detail. One of the most important lessons that can be drawn from this project is that the logic of abstraction between buildings and added modules is reflected in the representation of all diagrams. Let's take a brief look at these steps. Note that in all steps, a certain modulation language is adhered to, and at some points, perspective is distorted and space is used as a unifying drawing element to combine drawings. Sometimes you can show modules together in a schematic expression and at the same time provide functional grouping information about them. Which of these modules serve the information life cycle in which phases? How do these modules move in the city? Can these modules be combined to form a new module? Do the modules only create horizontal work floors, or can they also offer vertical experimentation areas? Producing diagrams that first ask and then answer all these questions will make your layout as dynamic as your design. No matter how organic or irregular the movement of mobile units in the city is, all movements should be presented with a linear or grid reduction. This reminds the jury that in all cases the city is viewed with an architectural approach. Precast modules for installations. Precast modules are great design items, both in architectural education and in professional architectural applications, as they allow countless combinations. In this example, a modular exhibition module design with the use of horizontal blocks is presented. One of the best ways to express the design is separating the layers. Ideas such as the idea of a vertical display, the idea of creating a screen, or the combination of elements to form a shape can be presented together. Diagrams about routes and public spaces. In this section, we will talk about the function of routes in diagramming. Routes are indispensable plan projections of how we will experience the space. Examining and following pedestrian movement in the plan spontaneously generates many diagrams. Visiting a historical building. This section contains 3 images. In the 4 different diagrams here, the most visited points of 4 different types of users in the area are expressed. In this way, if you scan the areas where you spend the most time and show them on the plan plane, you will show that you are working on how the area is used during the day. It is always valuable for the jury to go beyond the plan section view planes and present determinations on how the space is used in daily life. Here, the plan of the same historical building is presented with sketches of the area and diagrams expressing the functional groupings in the area. In the next image, the sketches are drawn in a more inclusive perspective to support the statement of the site plan. Tracing the historical layers in the area. This section contains 5 images. When expressing diagrams, taking advantage of size differences always makes your drawings look better. If you have a diagram, try attaching a small diagram as a footnote to it. Use the similar size relationship between items. Thus, you create the perception that you are presenting information of different degrees of importance. In the next image, you can see that this hierarchy can even be arranged into 2 completely separate timelines. Small diagrams associated with bigger ones can express another small flow within themselves. In the next image, it is possible to see the little bits of information coming out of the big diagrams. In general, such diagrams are located below or next to the main visual on the sheet, before moving on to the next phases. Other successive ruin plan diagrams show us how a gradual deterioration or dissolution that has taken place from the past to the present can be expressed when one wishes to simulate it in the present. You can divide the processes you want to highlight in detail into small sequences and present them as images. In the last set of diagrams of this project, the walkways, focal structures, repurposed structures and mobile modules in the area are presented in separate layers. Storytelling as a perceptual print. Within the scope of the architectural project, one of the easiest ways to tell a story is to listen to the users who experience the space. What these users say gives you an organic pattern that no plan, section, or view drawing can offer. The jury likes such in-depth approaches and finds them original if supported by good illustrations. Reduced descriptions. Another important issue is related to the same expressive language, emphasizing different areas with similar simplicity. Here, a very simple SketchUp model can be strikingly emphasized with the titles modular remission, corridors, under the greenhouse, connections, and multiple micro-farming. Diagrams about structural details. Create a powerful composition by showing materials, structural system, and joint details together. Structures for open-air spaces. In this section, seek answers to the following questions. How can the structure of the walking path of an outdoor exhibition be expressed? How can lighting elements and storage systems using solar energy be evaluated together with the design language of the stops in the area? How can modules with intense technical details, as in the example on the right, contribute to the main approach? Advantages of steel. This section contains 2 images. The first image shows all the steel components together in the 150 technique. Showing stairs, railings, columns, beams, floor elements, and vertical dividers in a single image will save you space. The next image shows that this approach, expressed in the diagram, can also be captured in a system section or an overall perspective. One image from Diagrids and details. And 2 images from membranes with moving structures. Transparency and structure. Transparency allows all structural elements to be displayed together, without the need for diagrams where layers are displayed separately. You can even increase the transparency of certain points with a careful use of eraser in Photoshop, and you can present all the details of the furnishing items with this dense information set. Diagrams about additions, furnishings, installations. Urban furnishing elements are ideal aids in connecting design elements and repeating linearities in your design language. They allow you to define your prominent axes. In this way, you can capture a rich composition by showing the movements of the people in your images around these furnishing elements. Containers for all. Containers, on the other hand, are among the largest and most useful of the familiar urban furnishing elements. It is an indispensable urban element in terms of modular production possibilities and spatial flexibility it provides. Municipalities, local initiatives, exhibitors love and often use containers for the mobility they provide. In this example, you see the units that attach to the perimeter of a mass housing unit and enable various public functions to be performed in the area. Urban equipments for open-air spaces. This section contains 6 images about modular units on a smaller scale, such as flower pots, lighting elements, trash cans, benches and bicycle parking units. The most important lessons to be drawn from these visuals should be to present such modules in an angle that will show all the technical possibilities of use and to show where they are in the site plan. You can easily show where all your urban equipment is located in your project by associating it with the isometric perspective. Diagrams about sketchy add-ons. In these last 6 images, we will talk about the advantages of the incompleteness effect provided by the sketch expression. Even if the finished products are presented in the plan section view drawings, you can use the loose texture of the sketching technique to express your exercises about the intermediate stages or to aestheticize your work at certain points. Fluid lines reflecting the thinking process. This section contains 5 images. Materials, textures, layers and layers. Sketching is a technique that reminds us that the pieces that come together are actually a result of interlocking lines. When combined with the watercolor effect, it helps to create very strong and unrestricted, free spaces. Please review the examples in detail, pause the video where necessary, try sketching a diagram similar to what you see on the screen, and try it yourself after noting what the implicit techniques are in the diagram. Diagrams. End of section. We have come to the end of this long, enjoyable and colorful section. Now it's time to ask yourself some questions. What did you learn in these sections? Which diagramming technique will you try to use in your work first? What is the place of diagrams in the success goal you set for yourself? Please share with us.